guys are the warriors here at the end of the night, and appreciate you guys staying and hanging strong for the final talk. So I'm actually not talking at all about my work at Cambridge. I'm talking about the undergraduate thesis work that I did at Princeton, just because I have a lot more data on it, and it's just a much more complete presentation, but it is related to what I do here. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the connections there. And before I actually get into the talk, I just want to say these are cows in a Costa Rican pasture, and these were some of my really good friends for many of the days and nights in the summer of 2011 when I was doing field work. Has anyone worked on a farm before besides Kevin? Anybody? Yeah, a couple. Okay, one or two people. So these guys are the nicest, calmest, stupidest animals you'll ever see, but they are terrifying at night when you're coming back out of a dark forest and you have your headlamp on, and you see 300 sets of eyes glowing at you, in the mist or whatever. So this stare is one that I got a lot, so that's why it sort of graces the cover of my presentation. But anyway, so that's neither here nor there. I'm talking about land use change and herpetofauna, not to be confused with herpes. Herpetofauna is a word that refers to reptiles and amphibians, which are my sort of focal taxa. So Colin talked a little bit about, he gave some of the context for the history of extinctions, and he mentioned that there were kind of 5 big extinctions in the Earth's history before the age that we're currently in, which is known as the Holocene, or the 6th extinction. And it's kind of an emerging extinction. It hasn't resulted in as many sort of casualties as previous ones, but a lot of scientists think that it's on the order of hundreds or even thousands of times faster that we're losing species today as compared to background rates. And you can see on this graph here, species extinction, human population. So the human population curve is the lighter green one on top, and you can see just a very close parallel between the two, and there's almost kind of this leading edge that you can point out too, with human population increasing, and then right behind it comes extinctions, to the point now where extinctions are kind of taking this exponential curve upwards. So it's very very real and doesn't look good for the future. And the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, actually estimates that about 1/3 of the described species are under some kind of threat of extinction. And that's the difficult thing about that is that most of the species on Earth we don't even know, we haven't described yet. So there could be even tens of millions of species potentially, and we don't even know what we're losing. So it really is sort of an extinction crisis. And some of the biggest casualties, no pun intended, are the megafauna, that I think are some of the coolest animals that we've already lost. So they were kind of the first ones to go in many parts of the world. So you've got the moa, the marsupial lion, woolly rhinoceros, and all kinds of other cool animals. So they have already kind of kicked the bucket as a result of human actions. So what causes biodiversity loss? Biologists tend to point to 5 major drivers of extinction. So Colin actually showed a similar photo on the chytrid fungus, which is in the top left there. So these are frogs that are just dying in all different parts of the world, and the declines have been going on for a couple of decades now. Thought to be tied to climate change, as Colin was saying, and also pollution, and there's a whole sort of host of factors intersecting that are resulting in these declines. Then the polar bear on the ice little flow there, it's almost like out of a Greenpeace ad or something. So this is, climate change is obviously a huge issue as well. Carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas levels are really affecting everything. And you guys know all about that, hear all about that. Overexploitation is a huge issue, especially for a lot of the charismatic kind of larger fauna. So you think of rhinos, elephants, tigers, things where there's a really strong black market for their horns, tusks, pelts, whatever. But there's also just it's a huge problem for all kinds of other species too, including frogs, which are often sold in markets as delicacies and things like that. Over here on the right, we have invasive species. This is just one example of how quickly an invasive species can kind of take over an entire region. So this was the cane toad introduction in Australia. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but basically they tried to introduce the cane toad to get rid of another sort of pest, and it sort of just quickly grew super fast in its population, spread all over the northeast of the country, and actually resulted in the death of a lot of native Australian fauna. So all kinds of problems, but the one that we're going to talk about more today is habitat loss and land use change, which ties in closely with the work that I did in Costa Rica. So here's a map of global deforestation, basically dating back to 7,000 BC around the time when humans really started to form societies and start making an impact on the world. And all the red is the deforested areas that have already been chopped down or cleared in some way by humans. Green is still existing forest. And so you can just see how massive an effect humans have already had. So huge swaths of the world, so almost all of Europe, big tracts of land in North America, all of this Atlantic forest in Brazil pretty much is gone. Large parts of East and Southeast Asia, Central Africa, you name it. So deforestation is really one of the major factors causing species declines. And one of the biggest drivers of deforestation is agriculture. So here's just two representations of that. We got a table and a graph, which both show about 80% of deforestation being due to agriculture. So small-scale agriculture, large-scale agriculture, pasture lands, and that dwarfs, for instance, logging at 5 or 8% compared to 80+% for agriculture. And so it's slash and burn, commercial agriculture, all kinds of stuff, and that's why I really wanted to focus on kind of the intersection of deforestation and land use change with biodiversity declines, and see what kind of solutions could come about in that arena. So yeah, these are just the particular areas that I'm going to be focusing on. So this is just a random image of a human-modified landscape. So this might remind you of something that you have seen outside a plane window or something. And this is kind of the effect that agriculture can often have on a previously forested tract of land. So you'll notice that, I'll come back to this in a minute after getting into some ecological theory, but you'll notice that it's not like a uniform chunk is just cut out. It's very patchy. And so that's really crucial for what we're going to look at in just a second here. So just keep this in mind, and I'll come back to it in a minute. So this is the part where you might have to think the most in the whole presentation. So just try to bear with me as I explain island biogeography theory. So in the 60s, two biologists, MacArthur and Wilson, came up with this really influential theory on island biogeography. And it was originally meant to be applied to an ocean environment with a mainland and literal sort of islands off the coast. But since it's been applied to a lot of other systems as well. So you see here on this diagram, here's the mainland. So this would be the coast of whatever continent. And this white area is just ocean. And then you have these 4 island patches, basically. And there are 2 major things that are different here, which MacArthur and Wilson based their theory on. So one is the size of the island, large versus small. And as you can see in this one here, as island area increases, the number of species that are predicted to populate the island go up, which makes sense, right? More area, more species. The other important thing is the distance from the mainland. So that has an inverse relationship with species richness, which is the number of species. So as you get further and further away from the mainland, the number of species declines. And so MacArthur and Wilson had this really influential theory that based on these 2 ideas alone, you can just look at a particular island and see what the richness, what the number of species there would be. And you don't have to get too caught up in the other figure there on the left, but it is helpful if you do want to think about it for a minute. If not, just check out for a little bit and come back when we look at the map. But you'll see there's colonization and extinction. And the colonization is the orangey-brown curve. And you'll see on the x-axis number of species, and then rate of extinction is on the y-axis. So as the number of species declines, increases, colonization decreases because the island's already getting saturated. And then as the number of species increases, extinction increases as well, just because there's more pressure for the resources. So those areas in the middle are the key sort of equilibrium points for how many species you'll actually end up with. And again, they're based on the large and small and then the close and far conditions. So this is the sweet spot, depending on which combination you have, of how many species you'll actually end up with. Does that kind of make sense? Generally. Okay. So the problem with this, although it was really helpful and there's a lot of good things about island biogeography, the problem is that people have for a long time kind of taken the ocean, the non-habitat area, to be hostile and totally unsuitable for any kind of life to exist there. and all the island and the mainland areas to be totally safe. So habitat, non-habitat, a very binary way of viewing it. But, which might be true with oceans, but when you start applying this system to like a terrestrial system, like a fragmented forest, you actually don't get that result, which is why I'm going to go back here, because this is pretty central to my research. So if you're thinking about this human-dominated agricultural landscape, there's all these different patches which could be agriculture. So here, 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 et cetera. And then you've got the forest interspersed in between. So island biogeography makes this assumption that any given patch will actually have the same permeability for species to move in and out of it, which is 0, right? They can't because it's not habitat. But in real life, we know that that's not the case. So this field could be a meadow. This could be a field of corn. This could be a tree plantation or whatever. This could be some kind of riverine system. So there's all these different possibilities that exist. And my research actually challenges the island biogeography approach because it says that in these fragmented landscapes, it's really important to think about what the land use type is, what the matrix is the fancy word. It has nothing to do with the movie or whatever. But the matrix, that's what we call it. What this stuff is made up of is really, really central to how the species are going to be moving around in the landscape. So, again, matrix is all this area that's not technically habitat, but might actually be. So my 2 questions coming to this research were, how do 2 different types of agriculture, so I picked heart of palm plantations, which I also call palmito, and then pasture lands, how do they support reptile and amphibian communities, and then what are the management implications of their ability to support these animals? I decided to work in Costa Rica for a couple reasons. So one, it has a really strong agricultural system that makes up a lot of its GDP. They export bananas and cocoa and all kinds of different products. And there's a lot of pastureland as well. And then ecotourism is also huge in Costa Rica. I don't know, I'm sure you guys have seen those red-eyed tree frogs on like all the rainforest like posters and stuff, but a lot of that actually came out of Costa Rica in the 90s. They kind of became this poster boy of ecotourism. And they're a really successful example of a third world country that has a much better situation than a lot of other similar countries because of their booming tourism industry. So all those reasons made it make a lot of sense to go into Costa Rica and do this research. It's also super rich in terms of biodiversity, especially in the lowland, wet rainforest where I was working. So I worked at La Selva Biological Station, kind of right in the northeastern sort of heart of the rainforest. And these are just a couple pictures. That was the little cottage where I stayed, and this was an awesome bridge that went across a really beautiful river, and it was a great place. And so this gives you a little bit more detail on the specific site where I worked. So don't worry too much about all the colors and combinations and stuff. But this is the actual forested area of La Selva. And then this is kind of a blown-up view of the area around it. So I worked a lot in the surrounding landscape, obviously, because I was focusing on this human-dominated landscape and how animals could live there. So the green patches in this image on the right are the forest that was bordered by pasture. And then the blue is the forest that was bordered by palmito. So I was working in 10 different forest fragments and then the surrounding land use area. So here's some pictures I took just to give you an idea of what it looked like. The pasture was not totally devoid of anything. There were often trees and shrubs and things, and they were all actively grazed pasture lands. So that was pasture then bordered by forest. Again, they always came in sort of a set. So a forest fragment, and then the area immediately surrounding it. So you had the pasture, and then the forest bordering the pasture, the palmito, which was basically a monoculture of these palmito plantations in row after row, and then the forest bordering the palmito. So that was my study site. And then you had these edges. So that's really important too, and just thinking about like how are animals moving across this space? Are they living in the forest and then going out to the pasture to forage and come back? Are there actual populations that are existing in these land use types? Those are some of the things we're trying to figure out. So this little image gives you an idea of how the transects work. So I basically did 400 transects. That was my entire study. And a transect is just putting out a piece of string or any kind of marker and then going along and identifying and catching everything that you see. So what I did was I had 400 transects evenly spaced out among the 10 sites. I also broke it up by night and day, by forest and land use type. And I spent 25 minutes on each transect and looked on a meter either side. So it was 50 meters in length 2 meters on either side, 3 meters in height, just like frogs, lizards, snakes, caecilians, like anything that I could find, I just caught it and identified it. And I had, although I didn't pick up the poisonous snakes, because there's a lot of like fertilances and vipers and things, so you want to be careful of those. But yeah, basically just surveying everything that was out there. So, and I ran them perpendicular to the edge. So this is the edge that you see there and there. And I ran them perpendicular to kind of get, you can do it either way. You can do parallel or perpendicular, but I just thought it would help me to see more easily where, at what distances the animals were into the forest, into the matrix, etc. Just a couple photos. These are my transect lines, the yellow string, and then that's a data logger, that little blue circle. I also did some vegetation measurements, hence the PVC pipe. So just to give you a picture of what I did. And then here are some of the cool animals I found. I wish I could show you more photos because there were so many cool things, including things that weren't reptiles and amphibians that you just run across in the forest. I saw an ocelot. I saw all kinds of crazy bugs and spiders and frog-eating spiders and just ridiculous stuff. I almost included that photo, but I didn't. But you can find it on my Facebook if you want to see the frog-eating spider doing its thing. I also found a bird one night on a transect and just kind of caught it. I think it was like in some kind of stupor because you can't usually just pick up a bird like that. But I did. So these guys like eat like mice and like, you know, snakes and all kinds of things. So there's a lot of cool animals. That's a venomous hognose viper. A lot of cool stuff. So results. So when I did I wrote up my thesis, and I had this sort of Viva-like thing, basically an oral examination. And my second reader, he had read my thesis, and he kind of looked at me, he's like, David, so basically what you're saying is the more something looks like forest, the more it is like forest, right? And I was like, yeah. So it made me feel a little stupid, but it is one of these... It is one of these things where you never know until you actually go do it. And there's a lot of like interesting patterns and stuff within what you find. So it's not like I didn't just like have to do the, oh, thanks. Plug that junk in. So it's not like I didn't have to do this, but it is kind of simple. Like structurally, if the vegetation's similar, it'll attract similar kinds of animals. So just really quick breakdown. This is obviously just a typical bar graph. Green is forest, blue is palmetto, red is pasture. And it displayed a really nice kind of just like high richness. Again, that's number of species, diversity, abundance. So high for forest, intermediate for palmetto, low for pasture, which wasn't altogether surprising, but it was cool to just see it work out that nicely, and across all those different categories too. Ooh. All right, we're up and running. So, all right, results. Right, so forest, high abundance, diversity, richness. Those are just different measures of... Oh, well. I'll just talk about abundance, diversity, and richness while we're waiting. So those are different measures of what's out there. So diversity is actually just an index, which is based on abundance and richness. And then the feathery things that I'll show you next, which are like the colorful things in the other corner, are called species richness curves. I don't know if anyone knows what those are. Basically, it's another way of reporting similar data. It shows you, as you get more and more individuals, how many species are you collecting. And so if you do a good job of sampling, they should flatten out over time, which I was kind of getting there, but there's a lot of stuff in the forest, so I didn't get a nice flat curve. But you can kind of see the same deal here. The colors are actually different. I'm sorry about that. But the two forests are blue and red. So they're this and this, and then the green one is the palmetto. So again, it looks a lot more like forest than pasture does. Pasture's a little stunty blue guy. All right, this is my favorite slide. So what are the management implications of all of my research? So this big black box, picture that as just like a previously untouched forest. But humans have come in and have cut down and developed certain parts of the land. So you have all this patchy white stuff that's either about to become something or it has become something. Nobody knows. So the question is, based on my research, what should we put in there? To both serve the economic needs of humans and to have environmental benefits come out of it. So when I came to Costa Rica, this is pretty typical of what, the kind of thing that you would find in my study region. So you've got all these different patches of forest, and then interspersed with that is just tons of, human agricultural kind of plots of land. So you've got the pastures, the palmito, and this is a simplified version. There's also banana and cassava and pineapple and all kinds of production going on. But if you can make as much money or more with a more beneficial type of land for reptiles and amphibians or any other kind of animal, it would make sense to replace the plots of things that don't support reptiles and amphibians with things that do support them. So in this case, that actually works out really nicely because I believe that palmito is actually more economically profitable than pasture. And pasture is no good for our friendly herpetofauna. So if we get rid of the pasture and then put palmito in again, this is an example of what your new landscape could look like. And now you have a kind of nice mix of forest cover and pseudo-forest cover that provides a lot of connectivity, a lot of ability for populations to move around and thrive. And basically, this is a really potentially nice picture of what conservation in the 21st century can look like, where you're meeting food security needs, you're meeting economic needs, and you're protecting biodiversity. So this would fall under what's called a land sharing approach. I won't get into too many details. Basically, land sparing is the idea that you just really intensively do agriculture and then totally protect forest reserves and keep them very separate as a way to maximize both. And then the land sharing idea is that you can do kind of lower intermediate intensity agriculture but have animals and biodiversity very abundant in those farmlands. So that's kind of more what this approach is like. So conclusions. Land use type is definitely important. We showed that there's a big difference between pasture and palmito in their suitability for reptiles and amphibians, and surely that extends to all the other kinds of land uses out there. They're not equally inhospitable like the island biogeography view says. Agriculture is also not a replacement for forests, though. You can't just have a bunch of agriculture and have it be sufficient for the habitat needs of a lot of the species that really need a forest environment. And I didn't really get into the details of the reptile-amphibian breakdown because it would take too long, but palmito is really, really good for reptiles, somewhat better for amphibians. And then kind of the last really important point, science-wise, is that the low contrast idea is a big prediction that came out of what we did. So we think that because the palmito was so close to the forest and its ability to support wildlife, that the low contrast land uses where you have pretty similar structure, vegetation, humidity, temperature, all that kind of stuff, will be the ways to go basically for, again, economic and environmental needs. And so conservation planners, policymakers, farmers, all those kinds of people should really think about how to have complementary forest and agriculture in the future. So there's a lot to do, but there's a lot that's happening. It's exciting. So thanks for everything, guys. Yeah, please ask away.
Questions?
I was also in Costa Rica in the summer of 2011, but I was doing research on primates. And so my question would be, how does this apply to them? Because I don't know if they'd be as successful in like a palmito-type environment.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I actually only saw howler monkeys and I saw capuchins in, I think, 2 or 3 of my forest sites. So, and those were some of the bigger ones. So the smaller forest patches, one on their own, can't really handle primates usually. And then certainly, I didn't see any in palmito or pasture. So this is a very, this is very specific to reptiles and amphibians. And sometimes the needs of different taxa overlap really nicely. And you can have like birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, whatever, in the same kinds of agriculture, but you really need, I think, some of the bigger trees and canopy cover and stuff for primates. So they would lose out on this kind of scheme. So that you definitely do need the big reserves and stretches of like untouched forest as well. This is just a complementary kind of approach. So yeah, totally. Agree.
More questions?
So do you know offhand where the herpetofauna in like the canopy level, or on the forest level, where it's most diverse? Because if you're only sampling to maybe 9 meters, but actually most of the diversity, say, happens in either, I don't know, subterranean, or if it happens above where you were sampling, then your results might only be depicting advantages for some of them, kind of like similar with the howler monkeys. And then I guess as a follow-up, I saw a talk by someone who's studying golden lion tamarins in South America, and she was really interested in sort of like these bridges that bridges of more patchy but almost and really thin stretches of forest that connect major patches that were large enough for the golden lion tamarin populations to survive. And so is that here? So maybe it's not an issue if you're only sampling up to a certain point. Like maybe are there those bridges that connect the big sections of forest in Costa Rica as well?
Yeah, great questions. So with the sampling technique one, I do think you're missing some of the animals if you're not going up in the canopy. But I also think we did a decent job with just going up to 3 meters, because a lot of the like vine snakes and very kind of mobile reptiles and amphibians do go up there, but they also come down to feed, and they have different sort of like cycles of activity. So we did both day and night sampling to try to catch as much of that as possible. And we also compared our results with like local guidebooks and kind of the local records of what people found in La Selva, which is really well studied. So like they know that pretty well. And we didn't miss any like major things that we should have found. It's just the kind of thing where, yeah, I'm sure there's some tree snakes or some frogs that go way up there that we maybe missed. But I think it was a lot of the diversity in our area was like the leaf litter frogs and like stuff that at least came down to the 3 meter and below levels at some point. So I don't think it was like a fatal flaw in the study, but it's certainly not a comprehensive picture. I mean, you'd have to sample for years to get all the animals out there, for sure. And then as far as the corridors, yeah, I know that was really big for the tamarins in Brazil, I think, because like some of the monkeys, like even if there's a huge stretch of forest across the road, like they won't cross the road, if there's not a corridor. I do know that so La Selva is actually part of a much bigger biological corridor called the Braulio Carrillo, like La Selva corridor, and it's a really sweet part of land because it's like an elevational thing as well. So you get tons of different species as you go up this mountain, and so they really try hard to make sure that there's like this swath of at least connected land, even though there's humans in the middle. I didn't really deal with much of that in my research, but there's definitely a lot of really good efforts by like the Costa Rican government to replant stuff and to keep those corridors open. So yeah. Yo.
I have a question. How often is the land that's used for agriculture disturbed? So how often do people come in? How often is it farmed? Or,
Yeah, that's a really important issue. This is a good segue into just a taste of what I'm doing now. So both for heart of palm, the palmito, as well as oil palm, which I'm studying this year, they periodically cut and replant everything, basically. And so that's definitely tricky if you're relying on X amount of species to be there and then you're cutting everything and replanting it. You could lose a ton of the biodiversity. But there are some like good ways to get around that. So if you, like oil palm has a 20 to 30 year life cycle. So if you can find ways to replant patches of it at any given time so that you always maintain a sizable fragment that's not cut down and replanted, then you can kind of get around that because the animals could kind of move around as the replanting occurs. So it is a threat, but it's not insurmountable.